Hello, and thanks for tuning in. And today's topic of conversation is betrayal. Now, we're going to start by trying to define what betrayal is. So, from that definition, we'll try and expand on the subject in more detail. So, betrayal can be defined as the act of violating trust, confidence, or expectations, often through disloyalty, treachery, or deception. It typically involves a breach of trust that was assumed to be reliable and supportive. An action cannot be regarded as betrayal in the absence of trust, loyalty, or commitment. Therefore, the existence or even the perceived existence of these foundations, which includes trust, loyalty, or commitment, is a necessary condition for an action to be classified as betrayal. Now, what causes betrayal? There are several factors that could trigger betrayal, and this can be broadly categorized as psychological, emotional, or social. Now, what are the psychological factors? Those factors include selfishness, greed, insecurity, low self-esteem, and lack of integrity. Now, the emotional factors that could cause betrayals include unmet needs, resentment, anger, and fear of consequences. And lastly, social factors that could trigger betrayal include opportunity, temptation, peer pressure, external influence, and shifting priorities. So, who betrays or what betrays? What element is capable of betrayal? People and organizations betray for various reasons, some of which have already been mentioned. Now, what made the betrayed place their trust in such a person or organizations in the first place? That's the question. Why was there ever an element of trust in this person? And that should be followed up with what qualities did the betrayed perceive in those who eventually betrayed them? So you must have seen something in that person to make you trust that person or confide in the person. Then suddenly you're surprised you were betrayed by that person. So what were those qualities that you perceived in that person or that organization initially who eventually betrayed you? So when we reflect on this, most will conclude that they did not anticipate the betrayal. Fair enough. And there's also a common saying that the saddest thing about betrayal is that it never comes from your enemies. So, but if this is really true, that betrayal never comes from one's enemies, what if our definition or understanding of what an enemy is has been misunderstood? So let's start by defining what an enemy is. So broadly speaking, an enemy can be defined as anything that stands in opposition to one's flourishing, safety, or purpose. Now, what if we've misclassified who our enemies truly are? In that classification, we've got it all wrong. For instance, if someone opposes one's flourishing, safety, or purpose, that does not always arise from malice or hostility. It can also stem from indifference, negligence, natural forces, or unintended consequences. An example of indifference, which could be portrayed as betrayal, is when someone has expressed their feelings about a particular issue or incident, and the person who that expression was relayed to just shows a lack of concern. So, just that attitude. Or someone was meant to do something and they didn't do, or they didn't carry out that task as expected. That could be down to negligence or natural forces, in the sense that there was a disaster and someone out of fear chose to abandon the other person and left the person to themselves, or unintended consequences, in the sense that someone had an intention of making things better, but by carrying out that intention, they actually made things worse. So this does not deny the existence of people who are genuinely malicious or bloodthirsty. Such individuals do exist. However, they are not the focus of this essay. Instead, the focus is on those we initially deemed trustworthy and incapable of betrayal. So, let's focus on who betrays and what this betrayal looks like. Sometimes the greatest enemy is not an external force, but the patterns of thought we carry within us. We do not see things as they are, we see them as we are. We project our values, fears, and desires onto others, and when they act differently, we feel betrayed. In reality, what we call betrayal is often the collision between who they truly are and who we imagine them to be. The real struggle then is not with the other person, but with our own assumptions and mental narratives about them. So to confide in and trust someone or something means to have judged that person or entity as embodying genuine value. How this value is determined is crucial. It cannot be subjective in the sense of being arbitrary. It must be grounded in something objective and consistent. True value must remain steadfast, regardless of who or what is involved. Now, to discern this, one must observe how trusted individuals or institutions treat others, what they say about people behind their backs, how they perform under pressure, whether their actions align with their words, how they navigate conflicting choices, and how they respond to feedback. Now, when examined closely, the betrayer often reveals traces of such tendencies long before the act itself. We simply choose not to believe that those same actions could one day be directed at us. We assume the betrayer reserves such behavior only for those people outside our circle. And so we are shocked when they eventually turn against us. Yet people consistently show us who they are if we are willing to observe carefully. The problem is that in our minds, we imagine them to be something else, shaped by our own expectations. Now, emotions play a significant role in this process, and in most cases, they cloud our judgment. Someone without emotional attachment to a situation can often analyze it more clearly, while the one emotionally invested tends to justify questionable actions until those actions are finally directed at them. Another factor that clouds clarity is one's life experiences and perspectives. Living a sheltered life often limits real world exposure and narrows one's perspective. It is a common assumption that a person in a position of power or authority is incapable of betrayal. Yet, the more life experiences one accumulates, the clearer it becomes that character is not defined by social or economic status. Now, I'm going to paint a scenario just to drive this point home. So I want you to imagine the son of a company's owner walking through the halls with a constant sense of belonging. Every smile seemed genuine, every greeting warm, every gesture respectful. Employees will go out of their way to shake his hand, to ask about his day, to treat him as though he were not just the boss's son, but a cherished member of their professional family. Now, this person grew up believing that this kindness was a reflection of who he was, his character, his charm, his worth. But when his father lost ownership of the company, the atmosphere shifted overnight. The same employees who once greeted him with enthusiasm now barely acknowledged his presence. Conversations that once paused to include him now carried on as though he were invisible. Invitations stopped coming. The warmth evaporated, replaced by a cold indifference that stung far more than open hostility ever could. He was bewildered. Hadn't they cared for him? That's the question running through his mind. Hadn't they respected him for himself? That's another question running through his mind. And the realization dawned slowly, painfully. the affection he thought was his own was never true or had never truly belonged to him. It was borrowed. It was just a reflection of his father's power and position, which he mistook for affection from those employees. Now, the kindness had been transactional, rooted not in love or respect for him as a person, but in the shadow of authority he represented. This sudden change forced him to confront a harsh truth about human nature and social dynamics. Respect given out of obligation or fear of power is fragile, vanishing the moment the source of power disappears. I'll repeat that. Respect given out of obligation or fear of power is fragile, and it vanishes the moment the source of power disappears. So what he mistook for love was merely convenience, and what he thought was loyalty was only self-interest. And in that painful awakening, he learned one of life's most sobering lessons: that genuine love and respect are rare treasures, proven not in times of influence and privilege, but in moments of loss and vulnerability. Now, to conclude this discussion, I want to stress that awareness is always the first step toward resistance. So one cannot resist what one does not first recognize. The more conscious a person becomes, whether in their environment, their thoughts, or the motives of others, the more capable they are of mounting a meaningful resistance. Ignorance, by contrast, leaves one defenseless. So often, the greatest enemy is not external but internal, which is the narrowness of one's own thinking. When a person fails to realize that their perspective is limited, they cannot see how their very mindset works against them. I'd like to repeat that. When a person fails to realize that their perspective is limited, they cannot see how their very mindset works against them. The true adversary lies within, which is the inability to expand one's horizon. Expanding that horizon requires deliberate effort. It comes through lived experience, honest introspection, and the courage to listen to voices that challenge our own. By weighing contrary perspectives and adjusting where necessary, we sharpen our understanding of the world and of ourselves. This process can be compared to revisiting a familiar book, rewatching a film, or reconnecting with an old friend after many years. What once seemed ordinary suddenly reveals new layers of meaning. The words on the page have not changed, nor has the film's dialogue, nor the friend's personality. What has changed is you, because you're still relating to the same book, with the same content, the same movie, with the same dialogue, the same person, with the same character. but you're now able to observe certain factors or certain elements of this people or thing which you've missed in the past. So, growth within yourself allows you to perceive what previously went unnoticed. The same principle applies to human relationships. A person who often carries the seeds of betrayal long before the act itself. I'll repeat that. A person who betrays often carries the seeds of betrayal long before the act itself. Yet, without the clarity of expanded awareness, those tendencies remain hidden in plain sight. Once one's way of thinking broadens, the patterns become unmistakable. You realize that the signs were always there. You simply lacked the perspective to recognize them. So in the end, the responsibility rests with you. It is your task to discern the character of those around you, to identify the people whose values are genuine and enduring. Power, charm, and appearances may fade, but integrity and high values remain constant. These are the qualities worth trusting, for they withstand the test of time and circumstance. Thank you for listening.